Thank you, and great to see everybody again. Welcome again. Thanks to Anita for such a great job of setting the stage for what we're talking about today. For talking about the humanity of crisis and how important that is at every level for travelers, for our private sector, and ultimately for destinations as a whole. What I want to talk about this morning is the experience of many destinations of moving through crisis. And what I've seen is some of the priority actions, but also some of the priority channels for communication to travelers, to the media, and to the world, and also to think about how we define crisis as well. Obviously, when something has happened, as it has in Sri Lanka this year, we tend to focus on that event, but also to look at some of the other potential crises that are out there as we move forward to be a more resilient destination. Cut my remote. One of the things to understand when we've been through a crisis is that destinations that never experience crisis, successful destinations, successful business, even successful people, often don't go through the learning process that crises or difficult times bring for us. Success can be a terrible teacher. One of the great advantages that we see when we move through a crisis is that we learn from it. The experience changes us and shows us what we need to be better and to be stronger in the future. Ultimately, sometimes we need to burn it down to make it fireproof. We learn through those trials by fire, as that term says, what worked, what didn't work, and what we need to do to change as we move forward to the future. And ultimately, as Anita said, you're not alone in many respects. As we see a change in the tourism marketplace and a change in geopolitics around the world, what happened here in terrorism is not unique to Sri Lanka. It's, as Anita said, something we're seeing around the world in many different countries. And in recent years, we've seen this challenge affect many destinations, many cities, many countries, many populations around the world. But each one of them has been unique. Each one of them has brought different impacts, and each one of them has brought different opportunities to rethink their approach to managing the destinations, managing crises, and an understanding of what works for them. So ultimately, it's that experience that creates resilience, the experience of destinations in terms of managing these crises, but also the experience of travelers as well. There's been a shift in travel behavior as people see that these incidents are happening everywhere around the world as well. We're seeing people become not immune to the impacts of terrorism, immune to the impacts of these disasters, but an understanding that effectively it can happen anywhere. It's not unique to a region, it's not unique to a culture, it's not unique to a religion. So being resilient means being prepared for everything. I've worked with many destinations around the world. I'm based in Kenya, a destination that has been through more than its fair share of crises over the years. But I've also worked with other destinations that have faced crises at a geopolitical level, terrorism level, and in natural disasters as well. And there's so many things out there that we need to consider when we think about potential crises. Terrorism indeed, but also biological and pandemic impacts, natural disasters as well, increasingly having an impact on countries and the tourism sector. But it is about being resilient for everything. And that means not just considering our destination, but even our businesses and how prepared we are to deal with the potential for crises in our businesses, with our products, and with our customers. What's something really scary that we should be considering at every level in tourism? These things. One of our sponsors here today, but I'm not talking about a brand, I'm talking about cars themselves. We consider the fact that every year 1.25 million people are killed in road accidents, which equates to one person killed every 25 seconds. And that is a tragedy for every family, every person involved in one of those incidences. And it's something that happens constantly. But how many of us in the tourism sector have a plan and a preparedness for dealing with what happens when a road accident impacts our clients, something that's much more likely to happen than a terror attack or a natural disaster? How prepared are we as a business to deal with those clients that are affected, with the families of those people that are affected, with the implications for insurance on our businesses? Being prepared means being prepared for everything. And what we've learnt is that having systems in place, having plans in place is what will help us through those times. And that means a sustained and owned crisis management system in your business, but also in the destination as well. And these need to be in place before crises happen. We need to think through what are the potential crises, what are the potential risks that are there in our business, and how we can be prepared for that. Ensure that it's present online, that we have online resources ready to be put into place to deal with the crisis. So we need to address our markets directly, and that reassurance is absolutely vital. It means that we need to be prepared, it means that we need to preempt what could potentially happen, and we need to do whatever we can to prevent possible crises before they happen, but be prepared to deal with them when they do. And it's about having a plan, looking at the stages of a crisis, what will happen before in terms of preparedness, what happens during it, and what we do in terms of response as we start to shift towards recovery. And our response is absolutely critical at the moment of crisis and the immediate period after it. And ultimately, as Anita said, information and communication is critical, and that has to be legitimate and it has to be trusted information. The second we address the public at a time of crisis, the second we address our partners with illegitimate, incorrect information, we start to lose credibility. And credibility is absolutely critical at a time of crisis. One of the examples you saw was Tony Fernandez and AirAsia and what he went through. If we look at that incident, that plane crash, and the way that AirAsia responded to it, the way that he responded to it, it was completely different from what happened at the Malaysian scenario that happened almost concurrently with their loss of an aircraft. But those two crises were handled so differently, and so much of it came down to response. And as Anita said, the human response. Look at the two press conferences. The difference between Tony's press conference, where he sat with the families affected, he joined them in the audience, he sat with them, and he connected with them, as opposed to the Malaysian press conferences where the information was unclear and in many cases incorrect. There was a physical barrier between their representatives and the families that were there. In some cases, those families were removed from the room when they started to try and question or argue with the company. It's about establishing that human connection and also showing support to the family, showing support to the media, to make them a partner that works for you, not in an adversarial way, but as a trusted and legitimate partner that you can work with. Supporting for the trade, particularly at a crisis at a national level. The trade is some of the hardest impacted in terms of your own citizenship. There's a huge risk of them losing their businesses. There's a huge risk of their employees losing their jobs. It's important to show support to them. It's important to show support to the communities supported by tourism and all of the businesses that are connected to tourism as well. Because ultimately, those victims can become attackers, particularly at a government level. When people are hurting, when their businesses are at risk of closure, when people are at risk of losing their jobs and their livelihoods, they often look for someone to blame. And if that is you as a destination manager that hasn't provided support, that hasn't provided information, that isn't showing them the way that you're going to recover and showing them that plan, they can target that anger back towards you. And they can become part of the negative messaging that you're trying to manage and recover from. And also remember something important. Saying sorry is not saying that you're liable. Saying that you're sorry for what happened, expressing an emotional response to support at a human level what people have been through is not admitting your liability. Of course you talk to lawyers, of course you ensure that everything you say has been legally protected, but there is no liability in connecting with victims. There's no liability in saying that something went wrong, that things didn't work as planned. During a crisis, that things could have been done better. Admitting that is not admitting liability, and it's very important that we show our humanity at every level, including what went wrong. When it comes to the media, we need to see how fast response has become. They used to talk about the golden hour in journalism, that after there was an incident, you had an hour to be prepared for the media, to get ready for a press conference, to prepare holding statements and press releases. Well, social media has obliterated that hour. News about crises now breaks within seconds of that crisis happening. It's generated by people who are involved in that crisis, by citizens with smartphones who start sharing content immediately during the time that crisis happens. Twitter plays such a fundamental role now in spread of information. And it's greatly affected the credibility of information as well. The huge amount of misinformation that's generated at times of crisis creates a very difficult environment to work with. I've seen this in Kenya, where we've had terror attacks that have gone on for a protracted period of time. The Westgate terror attack in Nairobi, for example, that went on for 4 days, similar to the situation in Mumbai. And trying to track what was happening at that time, particularly when social media came into play, became very difficult because of the amount of illegitimate, untrustworthy, or incorrect misinformation and disinformation that was being shared at times. So we need to make sure we find credible sources of information, particularly at that important period of the crisis and as we move towards managing communication and recovery. We also need to be aware that the mainstream media has a job, which is reporting the news. It is going to talk about what's happening. But also, unfortunately, we increasingly see that during times of crisis, the news has become extremely negative when it comes to the mainstream news media. It's a very competitive industry, the news world. Unfortunately, breaking news has become bait. It's something that catches people's attention, particularly in the online environment. It's something that gets people to click through and view content. The element of shock has become an important resource for selling the news. Fear has become a commodity. It's a story that gets people to respond. Once people feel fear towards something, they're going to watch out of their concern. They're going to have an immediate reaction to fear-based content. And we've seen that start to dominate news content. Outrage has become entertainment, particularly in the political space. And that's created a negative environment that ultimately becomes very difficult for a destination during a period of crisis. However, an interesting trend we're seeing that social media has delivered is the role of the public. And if we do get the public on side, both not just the people affected, but particularly the people in our own country, they can become an important ally. I'd like to talk about what happened in Kenya this year. I worked with Kenya as a destination. I'm an advisor to the minister and worked with our DMO and tourist board. We've been through multiple terror attacks in Kenya, unfortunately. Several repeated attacks, many of them targeted towards tourism. And we had one this year in January. Similar in some ways to what happened here or what happened in Mumbai. It was armed gunmen from a Somali militia group who entered a hotel with automatic weapons and suicide bombs and launched an attack directed directly at tourists. This has been a really interesting experience for us this year in terms of the impact of this crisis and the response to this crisis. As we talk about resilience and change, what we saw in this crisis is that it had the least impact of any of our terror attacks. It had actually, in the end, a fairly minimal impact on our advanced bookings. Some impact on cancellations within the first month, but much less than before. When we analysed the media for what happened during this attack, we saw something that was unique to this attack that we hadn't seen before. Of course, there was an immediate onrush of negative content, particularly in the social media space, that happened. The majority of it was from Kenyans. That's another learning that we had. Of course, the crisis is going to attract a lot of attention globally, but a lot of it's going to come from the country itself. People in the country are more aware of what's happening, more focused on what's happening than people around the world. And they become an important source of information, an important source of content. And the majority of the content being shared was from Kenyan people. But what's interesting when we look at the sentiments of that content, particularly from the Kenyan audience, of course it started out negative, shock, outrage, horror at what was happening. But it started to increasingly become positive within 24 hours. It was messages of support, it was messages of concern for the country. When we look at the negative tweets that were out there, a lot of it was actually predominantly directed at the media. A lot of Kenyans felt, particularly some of the newspaper publications, behaved improperly during this crisis. There was an issue raised about the sharing of photographic images of victims during that crisis, which was done without permission or contact of the families of those people whose bodies were published in international publications around the world. And the negativity was actually directed towards the media. And it was directed about the negative image that was being created about Kenya in the media. People felt concerned about that. And that conversation about wanting to control and own the story started to dominate Kenyan social media. We started to see positive messages emerging, saying Kenya is strong, Kenya is resilient, we're better than this. This term, "we shall overcome," started to be used in our tweets, and we started seeing a shift of content away from the images of terror, away from the images of horror that was happening that day, into this repeated message of "we are strong, we are better than this, we shall rise again, and we shall overcome." And that hashtag and that message, within 2 days, was the predominant trending message that was being communicated about Kenya. We shall overcome, we shall rise, we shall be better, and we shall be a better and stronger destination, until it completely dominated the social space. And as you can see, the dominant message over and over again on all channels was, "We shall overcome." And Kenyans themselves became the strongest and most positive ambassadors in terms of supporting the destination, pushing the negative news out of the headlines, out of the trending topics, and owning their own story and their own message. So as we move towards recovery, what we see is that the challenge is always about changing perceptions. It's important that we avoid making those knee-jerk mistakes when there's a crisis like this. We need to see this as an opportunity for us to start to change perceptions back and make our destination stronger and better. It's about avoiding those broad-stroke, positive, old-school marketing techniques. We need to think more about strategic use of our budgets to reach resilient and higher yield segments. Don't fall into the trap of reaching out to the bottom end of the market to quickly re-establish our numbers. Don't focus on covering all of the media with broad messaging, but start to target those segments that we know are resilient and likely to come back and spend higher as well. Don't start focusing on those unresilient markets. One of the challenges with many tourism models is who makes the decision about people traveling. As I always say, the captain of the cruise ships decides where people will stop and where people will visit, where people will go. And many tour operation firms will make a decision based on insurance that will affect all of their clients. All of those people disrupted by Thomas Cook at the moment, the decisions about travel have been made by a corporation for them. Focusing on independent travelers who seek independent information and make independent bookings, you can often find a more resilient, better educated, and more informed traveler. You need to think about millennials who are now owning and controlling the travel space and the way they source information and the way they make the decisions about how they travel, and those millennially aligned travelers in other generations that are starting to travel in the same way. People that are looking for experiences over brands, moving beyond the mass market into creating and customizing their own travel experience. And being able to segment and identify those people will help us find more resilient, high yield, and better informed travelers. We need to avoid the race to the bottom to try and win back numbers by price dumping and undercutting each other on price to try and restore numbers rather than yield and revenue. And also avoid turning safety into a brand. We want to reassure people that Sri Lanka is safe. We want to reassure our visitors that our destinations are safe. But safety is not a marketing message. If I repeatedly communicate that Sri Lanka is safe, Sri Lanka is safe, Sri Lanka is safe, Sri Lanka is safe again and again, what I'm probably suggesting to people is that it probably isn't, or there is some element of risk. People need to be reassured, but they don't need to be overtly told that a destination is safe. Do not make the mistake that Egypt made some years ago after one of its terror attacks by traveling around the country and taking photos like this, asking people to hold up signs saying, "I'm in Egypt and I'm safe," and publishing those photos, thousands of them, in social media. And ultimately, what did that look like? A hostage video. One person after another holding a sign saying, "I'm safe, I'm safe." This is not a positive marketing message. We saw this in Uganda, for example, after one of the Ebola outbreaks. Really holding up a sign saying, "Travel to Uganda, it's Ebola free." Putting the word Ebola in the middle of a swimming pool, probably not a very positive marketing message. Tunisia, after their terrible attack 2 years ago, shared images like this to show that beach travel was now safe in Tunisia. But how many people really see that as an appealing image for a beach that they want to visit? Images and messages that we feel may be reassuring or communicate safety, may be actually communicating something altogether different. It's about reassuring them in subtle ways, showing them the positive in the destination and taking away those negative images. In Nepal, after the earthquake, they used fantastic images like this to show how much of the country was unaffected by the destination. Maps and regions that showed where the earthquake hit, what sites were affected, what airports were affected, what hotels, what national parks, so that people could see that the majority of the country was still accessible, safe, and able to be reached. It's about finding those right ambassadors in the media that will communicate messages for you. People that have a connection to the destination. People that have a history of traveling to the destination. People who are based in the destination, in this case of Kenya, wildlife experts that live in the country. In Egypt, Egyptian authors, Egyptian writers, Egyptian social commentators talking about why it's a good time to come back to the destination and telling their story of the destination as well and why they find it positive. And focusing on authentic content, actual traveller experience, something we'll talk about this afternoon with TripAdvisor. How do we use people's positive experiences in the destination and turn that into marketing material and make them ambassadors for the destination? And remember that the road to recovery is paved with goodwill. When you have a crisis and the public respond to you and give you support, you also need to say thank you to them as well. And we've seen that in destinations who have reached out and thanked the world for supporting them at a time of crisis, such as Thailand, who communicated this message last year to the whole world.
How many of you? 13. Brilliant.
An entire country is one in heartfelt thanks. Without national boundaries, working in unity. The world is one. Thank you.
And actually reached out to the world for thanking them during that well-publicized crisis, when those children were stranded in that cave, and showed their connection to the world, the importance of tourism for them as part of a global community. So to wrap up, my main message is that this is about communication. It is about constantly communicating. But as we move forward through the rest of the day and talk about the future of tourism, also to understand that tourism itself is changing. The way we manage our tourism is so important. The way we define crisis is going to change as our markets change and as tourism changes as well. There are other potential crises out there we need to think of. Traveller change, the change of traveller mindset. Travellers have access now via social media to more information than ever about your destination. And their perception of your destination is very important to them in terms of making their travel decisions. Ethical tourism, responsible tourism is so important now. We can self-engineer crises if we are not aware of people's concerns about human rights, the environment, animal rights, and the welfare of the people, the environment, and environmental resources in a country. We need to think about what our perception of our destination, how we manage our reputation as well, and how we address changing travellers in terms of the experiences that they want to have. We also want to be aware that once we move beyond the crisis and start returning into growth, that growth itself sometimes is becoming bad news around the world. I consult with about 30 destinations around the world. If there's one conversation I'm having more than ever now, it's about what happens when there are too many tourists. Over-tourism is becoming a clear and present threat to travel around the world, particularly when it comes to the reputations of our country and the perception of travellers in terms of thinking about countries that they want to visit. The repeated line we're hearing around the world of, it used to be great, but don't go there now. It's overcrowded, it's somewhere that you don't want to visit, is a crisis unto itself when people start to talk about our destinations like that. And managing our tourism, managing its impact, and managing the client experience is critical to ensuring that our destinations have a strong and resilient reputation. And lastly, biggest crisis is yet to come. Because all of our resilience plans, all of our preparedness for dealing with crises will come to nothing when it's the climate and nature and the planet itself that presents us with the greatest crisis. As climate change starts to change our weather systems, change our countries around the world, one of the industries that will be most effective is tourism, particularly when it comes to our connection to coasts, our connections to the oceans, our connections to nature and the environment. Climate change presents probably our greatest threat when it comes to crises that we need to deal with as we move into the future. And let's not forget, we've just seen the world's best-known climate activist sail across the Atlantic Ocean because she refused to board a plane. Trend of not flying. The Greta effect, as it's being called in Europe, as people start to take trains and buses rather than flying within Europe. The threat to the climate posed by the aviation industry and its connection to tourism presents us with a major challenge that we need to readdress as an industry. And it means taking that seriously, because this really is the crisis that is going to dominate as we move forward. And while we focus on our own individual crises in our destinations, we need to remember that we are part of a global community, and there are global crises that we need to address together as well. So in that spirit of community, we're going to move forward today with our agenda of looking at some of the specifics of how we deal with crises, and then looking at the potential future that Sri Lanka faces as a destination and the travel industry faces around the world. I'm sure it's going to be a really informative, educational, interactive day, and I look forward to sharing it with you. Thank you very much for your time this morning.